Whenever people speak about the suffering of the Palestinian people, the response is really simple. They are suffering, it is terrible, but the solution for that is for the Palestinian people to live in peace. All they have to do is free the hostages. All they have to do is recognize Israel's so-called right to exist.
This episode of Think Twice is sponsored by the Jewish Future Promise, ensuring a vibrant and thriving future for Jews and Israel. And now a word about our sponsors. At the heart of the Jewish people is a promise that ensures our traditions, values, and future endure for generations. The Jewish Future Promise is a movement I endorse. It is a moral commitment to securing that future. By signing the promise, we commit to keeping Jewish life vibrant and thriving for the next generation. Join me in shaping the future. Make your promise today. Sign the promise, jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week we have an important and timely conversation for you with Ory Kaufman, author of the new book, American Intifada: How the Progressive Left Learned to Hate Israel and Love Hamas. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin Daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Why do so many Americans side with Hamas terrorists against Israelis? It's not because they identify with the ideas or societal norms that Hamas and its Palestinian Arab supporters embody, or because they find Israelis and their liberal democratic society alien to their worldview. It's because they look at the century-old war between Jews and Arabs and see only a race conflict between whites and people of color. This is nonsensical as well as illogical because this conflict isn't about race. Jews and Arabs are not different races, and at least half of all Israelis are, by the definition accepted by left-wing Americans, people of color because they trace their origins back to the Middle East or North Africa. But that doesn't deter those who are obsessed with race, which is to say those who have been indoctrinated in the new orthodoxies of critical race theory, intersectionality, and settler colonialism, as well as the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, from defining Jews as white oppressors who are always in the wrong, and Palestinians as members of a racial victim class who are always in the right, no matter what they do, including committing barbaric atrocities such as the one they committed on October 7th, 2023. But if you've bought into woke ideology, you can still look at Hamas terrorists and see George Floyd rather than a murderer, a torturer, a rapist, and a kidnapper who seeks the genocide of the Jewish people and the destruction of the one Jewish state on the planet. What produced this sort of ignorant distortion of the truth? Part of it is due to traditional anti-Semitism. But in 2025, we need to understand the way contemporary progressives have adapted their neo-Marxist ideas to encompass age-old memes of Jew hatred. What makes this so dangerous is that such falsehoods are not confined to the classrooms at Harvard, Columbia, and other institutions of higher education, but have long since filtered through to impact the way journalists, artists, and left-wing politicians think about both Israel and the Jews. In this way, woke ideology not only divides Americans about the value of their own culture and its foundations in the Western canon, but also works to undermine support for Israel on the political left. And rather than something that started on October 8th, 2023, it's rooted in a set of beliefs that date back several decades as politicians and the media have spread both misinformation and slanted analyses about Israel and its battle for survival. Someone who has been digging deep into this disturbing trend is Ory Kaufman, and we're pleased to have him with us today. Ory Kaufman is a New York real estate developer who spent more than 20 years working on an effort to get to the truth about the Yom Kippur War, visiting battlefields, interviewing veterans, and reviewing archival material. The result was his book, 18 Days in October, The Yom Kippur War and How It Created the Modern Middle East. He has now followed that up with his latest effort, American Intifada, How the Progressive Left Learned to Hate Israel and Love Hamas. Ory Kaufman, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Ory, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about what led you to write this book. When we last spoke in the week after the October 7th attacks, we were talking about your book about the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the way Israeli elites had bought into a concepcia about its security that led to a surprise attack and disaster. But exactly 50 years later, the same thing that most Israelis had sworn would never happen again did repeat itself with a new concepcia. Why did that happen? And why did Israel's military intelligence and political establishment ignore the threat from Hamas?
Well, you hit it right on the head. It was a classic textbook case of a concepcia. The best analogy I could think of is what happened in Munich at the Olympics in 1972. How could the Germans have left the Olympics completely unprotected to an attack by terrorists? And the answer is simple. It didn't occur to anybody that a bunch of terrorists would up and attack the Olympics. And if you had gone to the German security officials before and said, hey, there's a risk, they would have said, why on earth would someone do that? Wouldn't that hurt a terrorist cause? I mean, wouldn't that present them in a bad light? So it turns out when you're a terrorist, there's no bad publicity. Being a terrorist is never having to say you're sorry. All they care about is getting on the international agenda, and now we know that. What went wrong in 2023 was the Israelis figured that if they simply continue to supply Gaza, or as the saying goes, if it's good for them, it'll be good for us. Israel didn't have to supply Gaza, to be clear, because it was no longer occupying Gaza. Mm-hmm. True, under international law, when you are an occupier, when you are there, you have to assume responsibility for the health, safety, and well-being of the local population. But once you withdraw, that obligation goes away. So Israel had every right to just say, hey, you know what, we're done. But they didn't do that. They continued to supply Gaza, the thinking being, well, if it'll be good for them, it'll be good for us. They'll never cut off their only economic lifeline. They'll never blow up what we're giving them. They will never, in other words, sit down and commit an act of national suicide. Well, guess what? They commit an act of national suicide because we're finding out how jihadists think, which is, and look, Hamas leaders are coming right out and saying it, raise our kids, make a living. We don't care about that. We just want to commit genocide. So that's really what went wrong. That's really the whole story in a nutshell.
Yeah, that is, it is that simple. And yet, of course, people spin conspiracy theories. People want to blame the people whom they want to blame, whether it's Israel's prime minister or the judicial reform or the people who were against judicial reform. But I think one of the points you make in your book is that, as much as Israelis look within, it was kind of, Hamas was going to do this anyway, weren't they?
Well, I mean, there's an issue of timing here.
Right.
And the reports are just now starting to come out. And I mean, like literally every week we're learning something new. In the most recent report, what they're saying is that Hamas was going to do this in 2022, but they could not get Hezbollah and Iran to join in, so they decided not to do it. But then in 2023, they took a cold, hard look at Israel and said, you know what? Israel is divided. Mm-hmm. They've got all this internal controversy. The pilots aren't showing up. This is going to be our best chance. So it does seem, initially it didn't seem this way, but now based on the intelligence that we're gathering, what happened was they found a computer, a laptop in the area where Sinwar was when he ran away. They're being a little coy. It's not clear if it's where he was killed or where he ran away earlier. If you saw that video of Sinwar going away with his wife and his 2 little kids or 3 kids, whatever it was, it's not clear which tunnel they found it in, but they found a laptop. And on the laptop were the protocols of a meeting of the war cabinet of Hamas. And in it, they found references that, look, this is going to be our best shot because right now, Israel's really divided. Now, what it really shows, though, is just like we don't understand them, they don't understand us. And they're finding out that the minute they do attack, all those divisions melted away and the Israeli people joined hands. And so far, they are, at least in my mind, winning a pretty extraordinary victory.
Let's turn for a minute to the United States, which is, the title of your book, American Intifada. In your new book, you speak of how ideologies that cause liberal and left-wing Americans to see everything in terms of race turn them against Israel. How have so many educated Americans bought into the myth that Hamas terrorists and their Palestinian supporters are the moral equivalent of American blacks suffering under Jim Crow, which you rightly term as jamming the square hole of social justice into the round hole of the Middle East conflict?
So there is a wonderful, or like I say, there was a wonderful Jewish-American psychologist named Leon Festinger. And in the middle of the 20th century, he identified a phenomenon that he called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a phenomenon when people have really deeply held beliefs, and then facts appear that contradict the beliefs. People change the facts, they don't change the beliefs. If you remember when we were all kids, the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, that was not written as a kid's story. That was actually written as a satire. And that's exactly what Hans Christian Andersen was satirizing. The king, when he goes out naked, the child screams, "Look, the king is naked." But the way the story ends, the original one, is the king was committed to this crazy position. So he continued walking through town with his sycophantic ministers holding the imaginary cape behind him. Barbara Tuchman, one of the most famous historians of the 20th century, wrote a classic called The March of Folly, where she basically said, look, cognitive dissonance is most found in matters of government policy. When government makes a mistake, it always doubles down. And that's just because the two things you need for cognitive dissonance are people are very invested in something, and there's another group of like-minded people to provide a support group when the whole thing blows up. The way to understand it in this context is real simple. Just engage in a thought experiment. Let's go back to the October 7 attack. 1,200 people murdered, 251 hostages, many, many women raped. The attack enjoyed universal support among the Palestinian people, as confirmed by every opinion poll. The Palestinians regularly refer to Jews as apes and pigs. One more fact. The Biden administration budgeted billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Gaza, even if they didn't sign a peace treaty. And they would say, let's be fair, not for Hamas, of course, but for the innocent civilians, what they term the innocent civilians. Okay, let's assume every one of those facts is true. Let's just change one fact. Let's assume the people of Gaza are Germans of another era, or white South Africans, or white supremacists. In other words, white people, not people of
all the most fashionable villains of our culture today.
Do you really think that the Biden administration would have budgeted billions of dollars for the white supremacist innocent civilians? And now hold the thought for a moment. Let's carry this all the way through. Let's assume again in this parallel universe, white supremacists, not Arab supremacists, but let's assume they murdered 1,200 black people and raped black women. And then they said blacks are apes and pigs. And then a Republican administration said, we want to help the poor, innocent civilians. And they budgeted billions of dollars to those innocent white supremacist civilians who say blacks are apes and pigs. They'd be rioting in the streets. People would go crazy. So the bottom line is what we have here is a classic textbook case of cognitive dissonance. There are a lot of people, and I mean serious people, really smart people, and they're just as susceptible to this phenomenon as everybody else. And they have a certain worldview, and their worldview is white people oppress people of color. And by the way, there's a lot of truth in that too. The world is a complicated place. And if we were talking about, 1980s apartheid South Africa or Jim Crow, we'd probably find a lot more common ground than they maybe realize. But the point is, they look at this high profile conflict and it pits people of color, the Palestinians, against not just white people, but Jews, who in the minds of progressives are a white group of privilege. So you got the people of color in one corner and the white group of privilege in the other. They're backing the people of color. That's the way they're wired. The problem, of course, is the facts don't even remotely justify it. So they change the facts to fit the narrative. And that's what the book is all about. All the instances of cognitive dissonance where, for example, right after the attack, Barack Obama, very smart guy, very serious guy, he tweeted that we have to face facts. There's unclean hands on both sides. Why both sides? He said, because of what he termed the unbearable occupation of the Palestinians. Well, there was just one small problem. There was no occupation of the Palestinians. The Israelis had pulled out almost 20 years before. What was he talking about? I could give you countless other examples. I went on the search bar of Amnesty International, and I typed in the word rape. And this was in May of 2024. So by then, a number of Hamas terrorists had already admitted on camera that they had committed rape. A number of courageous Israeli women had stepped forward. There was a UN study that confirmed that rape had taken place. So you'd figure, they'd be there. Well, when I typed in rape on the Amnesty International search bar, 2,632 hits came back. Not a single one related to Israel. There was rape in Darfur, rape in Rwanda, rape in every corner of planet Earth, just not this. So I thought, well, that can't be. So I typed in Hamas rape. One entry came back. It was a Palestinian woman who claimed that the Israelis threatened to rape her. I mean, it's pretty obvious that, it's this cognitive dissonance. They can't bring themselves to back a white group of privilege against people of color, even when the facts are staring them straight in the face.
Yeah, I think part of this is also, ideology that has seeped into our education system, whether it's critical race theory, intersectionality, settler colonialism theory. All of this has indoctrinated, a new generation of Americans into this idea that the world is divided between, basically just two groups, the people of color who are always the victims and the quote unquote white oppressors who are always in the wrong and always doing terrible things. And they have defined, because it's sort of baked deep into the neo-Marxist origins of these theories, that Jews are white oppressors, even though, half or even a majority of Israelis are, by the definitions of the American left, people of color because they trace their origins in the Middle East or North Africa. And that's played a major role in this too, hasn't it?
Well, first of all, to be clear, the term people of color is a misnomer. Only 32% of Israel's population are what you would call classically European white or Ashkenazi Jewish. Mm-hmm. However, when people talk about people of color, they're not talking about Sephardic Jews, okay? It's a misnomer. When people talk about minorities, they're not talking about American Jews. And then someone always says, well, what are we, a majority? Ha, ha, ha. Well, no, it's a misnomer. When people talk about anti-Semitism, the Arabs say, well, we can't be anti-Semites. We're also Semites. That's not what the term, it means hating Jews. Again, it's a misnomer. More to the point, you are correct, college campuses, but really only the elite ones. There was a guy named, I think, Mark Kotlikoff, who did a study. Most American campuses did not suffer from this, I'll call disease. It was only in the most elite colleges where this happened, Columbia most notably, but also Harvard, a bunch of others. But the point of the matter is, I decided if I was going to write a book and kill a lot of Sundays doing it, I wasn't going to waste a lot of time talking about college kids. It's a problem. It's a real problem. But I think the bigger problem, far bigger problem, are the serious people, the people who really should know better. Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter, Tom Friedman, the New York Times, Amnesty International. I mean, I could go on and on. That's really where our problem is. I think that's where we need to focus our attention.
Okay, well, I would push back at you and to say that these theories have seeped their way all the way through our American educational system, as many other studies and the work of people who really concentrate on this. K-12 schools are also involved in, ethnic studies, critical ethnic studies. This has seeped itself, it's not just Columbia and Harvard, it's throughout our country, and it's influencing much more. I mean, the New York Times 1619 Project. But let's get on to something else. One of the really interesting and I think original aspects of your deep dive into the reactions to October 7th is the way you trace these toxic myths about the Israelis and Palestinians back several decades to the policies of the late President Jimmy Carter and his post-presidency. In what way did Carter anticipate today's woke ideologues? And tell us how a territorial retreat that he forced on Israel directly impacted the October 7th attacks?
Okay, so first of all, we're still paying the price for Jimmy Carter's irrational hostility towards Israel. If you look at his post-presidency, He made peace with everybody, including Jimmy Carter. I mean, you got to give him credit. He lived by the Christian ethos that he preached. He made peace with Ronald Reagan. He even had some kind words for Donald Trump. The only country that he just had this irrational hostility that he took with him all the way to his grave was Israel. And a lot of people noticed this. I mean, he wrote a book, which is on the shelf behind me, called Israel, Peace, Not Apartheid. And I'm telling you, there is a misstatement of fact on practically every single page. It is comically awful. And a lot of people ask, like, what is behind all this? And the answer was that he grew up in the Jim Crow South. He said himself, when he first visited, he writes this in one of his books, that when he first visited Israel in 1973, he associated it with West Georgia, where his ancestors took land from the Indians. And by the way, the reason he was able to go into politics was he was independently wealthy because his family had a plantation that was stolen from the Indians and developed by enslaved Africans. So certainly, he had what to feel guilty about. But the fact is, this has nothing whatsoever to do with Israel. We don't have enough time for me to give you every difference, so I'll just focus on the big three. Number one, Jews are indigenous to what was called Palestine. There have been Jews in Palestine for as long as there is history. We even know the day they arrived. It was July the 14th, 1406 BCE, because the story of Joshua commanding the sun to stop in the sky was probably a solar eclipse. And there was a solar eclipse on that day, which fits perfectly in the timeline of Tanakh, the Bible. But anyway, the first difference is the Jews are indigenous. The second difference is, unlike the whites who came to America unannounced and uninvited, the Jews were invited to come to Palestine. They immigrated there legally. The Ottoman Turks invited them first because they wanted European know-how, and then the British invited them with an international consensus. And it was done, the consensus was it was a mandate for a Jewish state only if the immigration was done in a reasonable, measured fashion, which it was, which brings us to the biggest difference of all. Unlike the whites like Jimmy Carter, who stole the land and chased the Indians off and killed them, in Israel, the Jews bought the land. They paid for it. They bought it from the Palestinians themselves at exorbitant prices. Historians have looked at this. Swampland and desert in Palestine in the 1920s sold for 10 times per acre what fertile farmland sold for in Iowa and Nebraska. And I'm not blaming the Palestinian Arabs. I'd have done the same thing. We all know what makes real estate valuable: location, location, location. But, to sell the land, and all the leadership of the Palestinians in that era sold land to Jews. I mean, to having sold the land, what's the crime that the Jews commit? It's so ironic also that, or I could say paradoxical, that the very progressives who argue for immigration today are the very people who say, well, that immigration is, of the Jews to Palestine, that's illegal, that's immoral. And again, it speaks to the same thing. It's because the Jews are the white people, and the indigenous people, they think, who are not really indigenous, the Palestinians, are the people of color. So immigration is a wonderful thing when it's people of color immigrating, but when it's white people, then they certainly have a problem with it. All of these problems with Jimmy Carter were felt at Camp David. Camp David did not happen because of Jimmy Carter. It happened despite Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is one of two American presidents, Barack Obama being the other, who took positions that were even more anti-Israel than the Arabs did. The big word in those days in peace process diplomacy was linkage. Everybody said that everything is linked to the Palestinian problem. Because the Palestinians wouldn't make peace, nothing could happen. Anwar Sadat said, I don't need a peace treaty with the Palestinians. I don't care. I just want Sinai back. So seemingly the road was wide open for a deal.
And to realign with the West and to get rid of the Soviets.
And the problem was Jimmy Carter kept saying, but I want a Palestinian state. Now think about what this means. Imagine you're sitting at a table with Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and Ukraine both want a deal. And an American president says, well, but wait a minute. I want to see Russia first make other concessions with respect to, Georgia or something else. It's craziness. Why? You always want to shrink the conflict. Why would you make it harder, not easier? The deal did happen, but only because Menachem Begin essentially wouldn't budge. And so we have a deal. But there's even one other point, and that's the Jewish settlement of Yamit. That was the other sticking point.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to get to as well.
Okay, so the Jewish settlement of Yamit, it's easier if I had a map, was built right at the spot where Gaza borders the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelis built it because they foresaw a day when they would leave Gaza, and they wanted a buffer separating Sinai from Gaza to block the entry of weapons. So what could have been and should have been proposed was do a land swap. Let Israel keep Yamit next to Gaza and give the Egyptians some land, further south someplace else. It was the obvious solution, and it was proposed. Jimmy Carter rejected it out of hand. He wouldn't even hear of it. And so now here we are. We're still paying the price for his irrational hostility. None of this had to happen. In fact, what seems to be happening now, the Israelis have now created this Morag corridor just to the east of Rafah. They are probably going to depopulate Rafah and use that as the buffer to prevent the weapons from coming in instead. None of this had to happen. It all happened because of Jimmy Carter's irrational hostility. And when his aides were asked, why is he doing this? They all said the same thing. He associates the Arabs with the blacks and the Jews with the whites. And it's completely senseless.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think another important book you make in this book is the way you revisit the heyday of the Middle East peace process in the 1990s and the Oslo Accords. How did both American and Israeli leaders prepare the way for the double standards by which Israel is judged in the conflict with Hamas and other Iranian terror proxies through their attitudes towards the Palestinians and terror then?
So in the 1990s, we had this wonderful, I wouldn't say wonderful because a lot of innocent people were killed. I shouldn't use that word. But we had a perfect control group. You had two conflicts coming in a peace process at the exact same time. Northern Ireland and Israel. And both, I'm not going to say they were identical. No two conflicts are identical, but they were pretty close. Two conflicts that had been around for decades, seemingly intractable, with two different religious groups that had also morphed into nationalist groups fighting over the same piece of land. So in the case of Northern Ireland, they set George Mitchell, then the Senate, formerly the Senate majority leader, and he acted as the intermediary, and he put down what was called the Mitchell Principles. The Mitchell Principles said no violence. Anyone who commits a single act of violence will not participate in the peace process under any circumstances, no matter what. And they kept to it. When the IRA commit violence, Sinn Féin was excluded from the talks. They never budged. There were some Protestant groups that did the same thing. They never wavered, and they ended up with a deal. Now, in the case of Israel, every time a bomb went off, Clinton would pressure Israel to keep making more concessions because to back out would be giving the terrorists what they want, so went the argument, which is frankly ridiculous if you think about it. What made it all the more ridiculous was George Mitchell was sent in after Arafat started the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and he issued a report, and he put out a different set of Mitchell principles. And no one would believe it was the same George Mitchell, because when it came to Israel, he said, well, yeah, the bombs are going off, but you got to go back and negotiate. And by the way, the settlements are a problem. I mean, it's craziness. The only difference that I can see is Palestinians are people of color. And so people who are liberal identify with them on some level.
Yeah, and George Mitchell seemed to have his own, irrational hostility to Israel, as did Carter. Yeah.
And then you're touching upon the Israeli left. And this is the worst cognitive dissonance of all. They've got, very few people in politics have the courage and honesty to say, you know what, I made a mistake. This was just wrong. Imagine you're fighting for this cause your whole life, and the cause of the Israeli left, and you're like me, you're old enough to remember, but their argument was, look, the problem isn't the Palestinians, the problem is the Israelis. The problem isn't terrorism and rejectionism, it's settlements and occupation. And the settlements and the occupation, there'll be a peace deal. It turns out that's just wrong. This is something that almost never happens in politics. In ideology, you can actually prove wrong, because it turns out when you offer to dismantle the settlements and actually do dismantle them in Gaza, and when you do withdraw, you don't get peace. You get October 7, you get suicide bombings. And still, despite everything, the Israeli left is still out there with all their crazy theories for why these things are happening. It's not because they made a mistake, of course. It's always Israel's fault. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu is, I think, the most unfairly maligned politician on the face of the earth. They've always got some theory why it's really Netanyahu's fault. And just looking at it with any objectivity you can muster, it's perfect insanity.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. And then, you raised the point I just wanted to get to, is that what blinded Israeli left-wingers to the truth about the conflict, and what, to some extent, although most of the Israeli public has sort of rejected them, the Second Intifada sort of literally as well as figuratively blew up Oslo. the withdrawal from Gaza, and then the creation of a terrorist state, and then October 7th. Do you think we're seeing some of the same unwillingness to confront reality among those who are protesting the current government in Israel's determination to continue the war until Hamas is eradicated? Is this sort of an aftershock from the unwillingness which you talk about and write about the peace process with the Palestinians?
We absolutely are seeing it. It is complete irrationality. So the big argument of the Israeli left now, everything is Netanyahu, and they absolutely cannot stand him. He's reviled, unfairly so in my view. But here's the big argument right now. So the people who want to get the hostages back, and of course we all want to get the hostages back, but there are some of us who think Israel should not put itself in a position where it's going to have to do this again in 10 years. And there are some. So here's what the people who are against Netanyahu are arguing. They're saying, okay, let's do the following. Let's do the deal to get the hostages back. We'll agree to end the war, but we all know Hamas is going to break the ceasefire at some point, and then Israel will just go back in and wipe them out. Now, because it's so obvious that Israel should do this, and because Netanyahu won't do it, it must be that Netanyahu won't do it because of political reasons. He only wants to stay in power. He knows if he does that deal, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will leave, and his government will fall, and that's why he won't do the deal to save the hostages. He'd rather be in power than save the hostages, so say these people. Now, this argument is so nonsensical, I don't even understand how sensible people can say it with a straight face. First of all, let's just look at the evidence. By my count, in the year 2024, Benjamin Netanyahu put forth 7 different hostage proposals. Each time, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich said, if you do this deal, we will pull out and pull your government down. But he proposed it anyway. Now, Hamas turned him down every time, and that's why the government survived. And when they finally did the deal with Trump, the government would have fallen. It's just that he managed to convince Smotrich to stay by swearing they'd go back to war, which, by the way, he kept his word, and because he had Gideon Sa'ar. But the point is, he's shown a willingness to commit political suicide if he thinks it's in the country's interest. He did the same in the 1990s, by the way. Mm-hmm. Back then, the big issue was the White Plantation Agreement. And the right-wingers in his cabinet in those days said, if you sign this agreement, we will pull out and there will be elections. And that's exactly what happened. They brought the government down. There were elections. And Netanyahu was not doing well in the polls. And Ehud Barak beat him by the widest landslide in Israeli history up to that point. So again, he has shown a willingness to commit political suicide if he thinks it's in the national interest. As for the argument itself, it's laughable. Hamas is psychopathic, but they're not stupid. Before they sign on to any such deal, it is going to be guaranteed by America, Russia, the EU, China, Turkey, Egypt. There's going to be a UN Security Council resolution. Everyone is going to obligate itself to make sure Israel doesn't go back to war. The idea that Israel could just cast this aside and go back to war, it's ridiculous. It's an absurdist position, but people present it anyway, even serious people, all because of their blind hatred of Netanyahu.
Yeah, I think, also, we've heard these arguments before. This was the argument in 2005 during the withdrawal from Gaza, when Israel withdrew every settlement and soldier from Gaza, as he said, and ended the occupation of Gaza, even though much of the world still pretends that it was occupied during those years. But Sharon said, well, if they use Gaza to shoot at us, we'll come back in and wipe them out. But of course, Israel didn't do that because it couldn't, because the world wouldn't let them do it. The price would have been, enormous. So these arguments don't really take into account historical reality, because we've already been down this road before.
It's absolutely the case. And what you said a moment ago is so true in the sense that when Israel pulled out, okay, they dismantled every settlement. They even actually, there were cemeteries. They even dug up the people who'd been buried there. They didn't leave a Jewish molecule there. I'll let you in on a little secret. They actually even withdrew beyond Gaza, because there's an area called the Tochemet HaTzfonit, which means, I mean, loosely translated, the northern sliver. And it was just that there were 3 settlements and the Erez industrial park there. They even withdrew from there. Now, that northern sliver was not built in Gaza. It was actually built in what before 1967 was no man's land. The land between Israeli troops and UN troops, or before that, Egyptian troops. Now, Israel has just as much claim to no man's land as the Palestinians, but Sharon didn't even want to leave a germ of doubt that he left every granule of sand. And yet, well, here it is. I have it with me. The New York Times published, I have it right here, on September the 20th, 2007, page A12. Here goes. And you can see I cut it out. Under international law, Israel is considered an occupying power in Gaza, even though it has removed its troops and settlers from the territory. Which international law is that one? This is not like some crazy thing that slipped out while the editor was on vacation. This is every single story in the New York Times from 2005 right up to the attack, that yes, they withdrew, but it's really under occupation. So, and therefore Israel owes Gaza.
This idea that it's an open air prison, which is, it does not conform to the reality of what Gaza was before October 7th.
Well, that's laughable as well, because, again, this is where it literally becomes comical. Before October 7th, excuse me, first of all, Israel was supplying Gaza. And the conditions there economic weren't even all that bad. So in some open air prison, the New York Times, by the way, called it a draconian blockade. So I looked it up. In the last year before the war, in 2022, Israel supplied Gaza with 5.7 billion gallons of water, 67,000 trucks filled with supplies, food, clothing, baby formula, you name it. 2/3 of Gaza's electricity, all of its fuel. 17,000 Gazan Palestinians had license to work in Israel and take home a paycheck. So far from a draconian blockade, it was the only war in the history of the world where one side was supplying the other. And wait, people in Gaza could leave if they wanted to. They could go out through Rafah. Humanitarian cases could go through Israel, and they could go anywhere they wanted to. Now that President Trump has talked about a voluntary immigration program, the very groups that accuse Israel of an open-air prison are saying, no, you can't have them leave. If they leave, you're depopulating. In other words, they want to turn it into an open-air prison.
Yeah.
Agnes Callamard, the nutty executive director of Amnesty International, who has this long record of saying absolutely crazy things about Israel, she has put forth this argument that by allowing people to leave because they're not rebuilding it, they're therefore compelling them to leave. Therefore, it's really a genocide or something like that, or depopulating or ethnic cleansing. So first of all, the Israelis are not forcing anyone to leave. They can stay if they want. They've announced that anyone who wants to come back can come back. So that doesn't sound like ethnic cleansing to me. But again, before the war, she was saying it was an open-air prison. Now she wants to turn it into an open-air prison.
Yeah, just cognitive dissonance, as you said before. Now, you note in your book's concluding chapter that most Palestinians share, quote unquote, Hamas's values. In practice, what has that meant? And do you believe that this really does doom any attempt at any kind of solution to the conflict, the two states or whatever you want to call it, for the foreseeable future?
So first, let's talk about what that attitude means, okay? If I were to ask you, what is the role and the function of government? You would probably say, it's to improve the lives of the citizenry. And then you might shrug and say, was that a trick question? Isn't that obvious? Okay, to them, it's not so obvious. To them, the purpose of government is to spread radical Islam. That's the most important value. It's the same for Iran. It's the same for ISIS. It's the same for any radical Islamic ideology. They want to spread radical Islam to the exclusion of everything else. And that is why, even though, Iran experiences power outages every single day, and even though they've got a lot of inflation, they're still spending most of their money supporting the Houthis, supporting Hezbollah, supporting God. That's the most important priority to them. What's it going to take to have a peace treaty? It's going to take a change in that attitude. Now, what would bring about a change in that attitude? The only thing I see is military pressure. There was a time when people thought the German people could never change. Winston Churchill once said, a Hun, that was the slur in those days, a Hun armed is a war in prospect. But what do you know? After losing the war and having their country demolished, they did change. I'm not looking for bloodshed or suffering for no reason, but maybe this is what has to happen for the Palestinian people to finally realize that this just is not the way to go. I don't know
Yeah.
a better idea. I wish I did.
Yeah. Now, you also devote a chapter of your book to the rise of J Street, the left-wing lobby here in the United States. Though their views are irrelevant to the realities of the Middle East and the point of view of the overwhelming majority of Israelis, why have they retained legitimacy in the eyes of outlets like the New York Times? And do you think they are being replaced on the American Jewish left by those who are more honest about their opposition to Zionism and even to their left?
It's a good question. I don't honestly know what motivates these people. I mean, I do know what motivates them. They want to fight racism. And that's why they've gone behind every single, whether it's Black Lives Matter or anything else. That is how they view the world. In their worldview, white people are oppressing people of color. That's how they see this. They are not the role they play is they give anti-Israel people political cover. So they could say, well, I'm just, like J Street, I'm pro-Israel. I just believe in peace. But then when you look at the things that J Street has done over the years, practically condemning the Abraham Accords, saying it was just a business deal. And when Israel was negotiating, it should even say is negotiating with Saudi Arabia, they've brought back the whole Jimmy Carter linkage idea. They're saying, well, no, don't do a peace treaty. We need something for the Palestinians as well. That's why people on Capitol Hill are saying it's going to be so difficult to get a deal done with the Saudis, because the Saudis made it clear, certainly before October 7th, they don't really care about the Palestinians. They really want to get this deal done. And they have a lot of reasons for getting a deal like this done. But the Democrats are the ones who are saying, no, but we need something for the Palestinians. And, all you could do is just throw up your hands and wonder, why are they so motivated to help the Palestinians when the Palestinians have made it clear they don't even want to live in peace themselves? So why would you torpedo the peace treaty you can have? And think of how important a peace treaty that would be. Why would you torpedo that in the name of a people who refer to Jews as apes and pigs and refuse to live in peace?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of projection, and this sort of it's a mania of the left in which they don't give people like the Palestinians any agency and just see them as a reflection of their own ideals and own ideas about what should happen, and don't actually pay much attention to what the Palestinians actually want.
I could not agree with you more. And whenever people speak about the suffering of the Palestinian people, the response is really simple. They are suffering. It is terrible. But the solution for that is for the Palestinian people to live in peace. That's it. They could stop it tomorrow. All they have to do is free the hostages. All they have to do is recognize Israel's so-called right to exist. All they have to do is agree to the two-state solution. If they would just do that, all the suffering ends, all the problems go away. I would also point out that Israel is not even asking for that. Israel has put forth what I would have to describe as the most generous terms in the history of warfare, and that is not an exaggeration. You've had this hideous attack. It was started by the Palestinians. No one disputes that, okay? The Israelis are not asking for any compensation. They're not asking for any land. They're not even asking for a peace treaty. Stop and think about that one for a minute. All they're asking is that the hostages be freed and the Palestinian leadership go into exile. And the response to that from many liberals, and it is liberals, imagine their response is, just to put this in a proper context, imagine we're closing in on Berlin. We've had this horrible, hideous war. And now someone says, no, wait, we have to stop. The innocent German civilians are suffering too much. We need a ceasefire. Leave the Nazis in power. Yes, they say they're going to attack us again. Let's rebuild Germany. And yeah, they're going to attack us again. But this is what we have to do because of the innocent German civilians. Okay, no one would say this. It's insanity. And that is why this logic has never been employed against anyone in the history of the world except for Israel. And so what I think liberals have to ask themselves is, why is Israel different? And does everything change because Palestinians are people of color?
Yeah, and the truth is they're treating the Israelis as if they're the Nazis, which is, of course, part of the anti-Semitic, demonization of Israel that is at the core of this war, which is promoted by both the Palestinians and their leftist allies abroad.
Right. And think for a moment about the settlements, okay? The three things on planet Earth that get the worst press is climate change, Vladimir Putin, and Israeli settlements. Everybody loves to hate the settlements, right? Okay, again, Let's engage in that same thought experiment. Let's assume every fact of the Arab-Israeli conflict happened exactly the way it did. Let's just change one fact. Let's assume the invaders in 1948 was Germany, not the Arabs. So the UN has a partition plan. Israel says yes. Germany says no, as the Arabs did. Germany invades, as the Arabs did. Germany kills every Jew in Judea, Samaria. They ethnically cleanse it, and they rename it, as the Arabs did. But let's Germanize it, not West Bank. We'll call it Westbankenstaat. And now Germany is in an ethnically cleansed Westbankenstaat for 19 years. It's 1967, and Germany attacks again, as Jordan did. Only this time the Jews win. And now the very people who used to live there show up and say, this is my home. I grew up here. I want my home back. The founder of the settler movement was a guy by the name of Hanan Porat, was in exactly that situation. Do you really think that the New York Times or Christian Amanpour would say, you can't have your home back? This is Westbankenstaat. Germany invaded. They killed all the Jews. The Jews were slaughtered fair and square. Nobody would say it. It's insanity. And that is why in the fall of 1967, no one did say it. That is why the UN Security Council, which is not exactly known for its pro-Israel sympathies, passed Resolution 242, which was worded in a way to leave the door wide open for territorial compromise, which is the only solution here. So the question people have to ask themselves is, does everything change merely because Palestinians and Arabs are people of color? Does that make that case of ethnic cleansing suddenly legitimate? The only one in the history of the world that would be legitimate? Of course it shouldn't. But of course it does. And that's because of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. Now, one of the main aspects of commentary about the post-October 7th war and the, as you term it, the American Intifada, is the myth that Israel is committing genocide and war crimes in Gaza. What does international law actually say about such conflicts, and is Israel obeying it?
Israel is obeying international law to a degree that no country has probably in history up to this point. And a lot of military analysts like Richard Kemp have said this. Mark Milley said this after, no, it wasn't Mark Milley, it was Martin Dempsey. He was one of the American chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff after Protective Edge. Let's just put this in context. The United States went to war to destroy ISIS. It's called Operation Inherent Resolve. At a time in which fewer than 100 Americans were killed by ISIS on American soil, Barack Obama decided to blow it off the map in parts of Iraq and Syria. Now, we supplied 70% of the air power. The Brits supplied 20%. And the last 10% was Canada, France, Australia, and a bunch of others. So you have a perfect statement of all the enlightened countries of the world. Now, those countries did not want to take casualties. So they did not send in ground troops. The ground troops were Kurds and they were Iraqi security forces. Instead, what we did was we sent our air forces out there and we literally blew every city they had right off the map. The Rand Corporation wrote a history or a semi-official history of the conflict for the Defense Department, as they often do. It's called Operation Inherent Resolve. It's actually on the internet. Anyone can download it. They describe the city of Mosul, a city about as big as Philadelphia, over 1.3 million people. They described it as effectively destroyed. Two American colonels estimated the damage there at over $100 billion. And that's only one city. There was Ramadi, there was Raqqa, there was Fallujah, there's all these other places. Ramadi's a city of about 400,000 people. The Rand Corporation described it as, quote, reduced to rubble. This is what we did. Obama deliberately bombed the main hospital in Mosul. It's called the Salem Hospital. This happened in December of 2016. CENTCOM issued a statement explaining why. You're entitled to do this under the Geneva Convention, Article 19. It was being used for military purposes. There's a picture of it that was taken by the Associated Press. It's a smoking wreck. And how many civilians did we kill? According to a guy named Hoshyar Zabari, who was Iraq's foreign minister for about 11 years, he was assistant prime minister. He's the head of the Kurdish community. He's one of the most senior people there. He's also from Mosul. He grew up there. He's from there. He said we killed 40,000 civilians just in Mosul. Again, only one battle. By comparison, Israel has sent in ground troops. They've killed civilians at a rate that was less than one civilian to one terrorist. These are numbers no one else has achieved. It's been achieved at a terrible price. I don't have to tell you, over 400 Israeli soldiers were killed so far. That's after October the 7th in the battle in Gaza. Many thousands were severely wounded. That's what Israel did. So, I mean, the idea that Israel is committing genocide, it's ridiculous, especially when you look at the fact that the Palestinian population keeps growing. not contracting. So if anything, is Israel's committing genocide in reverse.
Now, a major aspect of the debate within the American Jewish community about the aftermath of October 7th is what we should think about the Biden administration. You write that Biden didn't want Israel to lose, but he also didn't want it to win. What then did he really want to happen? And did he envision a post-war peace settlement with Hamas, kind of in much the same way that Henry Kissinger didn't want a complete defeat of Egypt in 1973, which you've written about? And if so, how wrong-headed was that idea?
Well, you hit it right on the head. He wanted a mixed outcome to match his mixed feelings. That's why they said, don't go into Rafah, which of course they had to do to win the war, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to cut off the flow of weapons from Sinai into Gaza. It was a constant case of tug of war to get the weapons they needed, to get the bombs that they needed. If you remember, if you go back to July of 2024, Israel killed Mohammed Deif, who was, I guess you could say, the chief of staff of the Hamas army. I think it was on July the 17th. This was a major, major blow to Hamas. Deif was something of a legendary figure in their circles. The Israelis had attempted to assassinate him 7 previous times and failed every one. Each time his stature obviously grew. He was wounded 3 times. The guy seemed to be unkillable. They got him on the 8th try, and it really seemed like Hamas was staggered. And according to reports out of the region, Hamas was starting to get a little more flexible on some of the terms for a hostage deal. But then on July the 25th, Kamala, the vice president,
Kamala
Harris gave a speech where she said, there's been too much suffering and I won't remain silent and Israel can't do this. And after that, Hamas just stopped showing up for the talks at all. They wouldn't even negotiate. And, what's there to say? Again, imagine we're closing in on Berlin and someone says, we got to stop. Look at the poor innocent German civilians are suffering. No one would even think of saying something like that. So, here we are. Again, I don't think they wanted Israel to lose, but I don't think they wanted Israel to win either. They've got very mixed feelings about this conflict.
Yeah. Now, you've already noted, and you wrote in your book about your admiration for Prime Minister Netanyahu, but obviously that's not a view shared by all Israelis, even if they don't hold on to hopes for a land for peace deal. Why is it that Netanyahu is so embattled at home as well as abroad?
It's a really good question. Abroad, it's easy. They have to blame someone. They can't just accept the fact that the Palestinians don't want to live in peace. They refuse the 2-state solution. It's as simple as that. So they're constantly making up these tall tales. I mean, I could tell you right now what the debate is. The big debate going back to the 1990s was, which comes first? Is it first the Palestinians agree to live in peace and then they get a state? Or is it first we give them a state and then somehow it all works out because the peace fairy comes? Hard as it is to believe, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres argued for the second. And that is why the Oslo Framework Agreement, it's shocking when you think about it. Israel gave them guns, gave them a security force, gave them money, gave them land, and all they asked in return was that at some point in the future, the Palestinians recognize Israel's so-called right to exist, which, by the way, they never did. It was the Americans who even put in a side letter, no violence. They didn't even ask for that. It's shocking. Benjamin Netanyahu said, no. We're not waiting for the peace fairy because the peace fairy never comes. It's first you got to live in peace, then we give you a state. Common sense. So people say, this shows he doesn't want the 2-state solution. It's nonsensical. As far as inside Israel, it's really a lot harder to understand. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Israel, unfortunately, has what I refer to as I don't know any other way to refer to this. It's white minority rule. There are many sources of power. It's obviously not apartheid like that because it's not premised on racism. It's a liberal variant of a very bad idea where you have all of these power centers that are totally not accountable to the people, like the Israeli Supreme Court, where the judges just replace themselves, like the so-called attorney general, who's not a legal advisor. She's basically a legal taskmaster. And again, all of them separated out by law in a way that the elected class cannot control them. He's trying to break that. And that's making the people on the other side lose their minds.
Yeah, I think it's, as much as we rightly speak of a century-old war between Jews and Arabs over possession of the land of Israel, There's been I would say, at least an 80 or 90-year war between the Jewish right and the Jewish left inside Israel, and this is just the latest iteration of it. The left, which has once dominated Israel, now is consigned to a minority, and the more in the minority they are, the more they cling to whatever grasp of power they have, which in this case is the judiciary, and therefore they want Israel to be ruled by the judiciary. And I think this is just how it plays out, because they fear that the demography means that the Mizrahim and the religious are going to eventually just be the majority, and that'll be the end of sort of left-wing Israel.
Yeah, and that's what this whole business started in the 1990s with a justice named Aaron Barak. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned white minority rule. The Supreme Court, Israel Supreme Court, has all the hallmarks of white minority rule. They issue all these rulings. The Israeli public has no say whatsoever. The reason is, in America and in every democracy, the judges are appointed by the people, either in elections or by the elected class. One of the reasons you'll vote for a Democrat versus a Republican is, a Democrat's going to appoint a certain kind of judge, and a Republican will appoint a certain kind of judge. And that's the way it's supposed to be in a democracy. In Israel, it doesn't work that way. The judges are appointed by an insular committee dominated by the judges themselves. So think about how that would work in America. We have a Supreme Court that's now 6-3 for the conservatives. If the judges replace themselves, you would always have a conservative court, always. And they could rule, forget about taking away the right to an abortion. They could ban abortion. They could rule that a fetus is a human being under the 14th Amendment, entitled to equal protection, and there's literally nothing you could do about it because the judges just replaced themselves. That's how it works in Israel. But instead of being a conservative court, it is a radically liberal court. That's the first aspect. The second is they have these crazy super rights. Not because the Israeli public gave them those rights, they arrogated those rights to themselves. It's called the Bank Mizrahi case. They issued it 2 days after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. So while the public was stunned and totally distracted, they ruled in some case, little commercial case that no one was paying attention to, that from now on, they have to approve everything in the country, and the standard is whatever they consider to be reasonable. Think about that for a minute. What made this blow up was they canceled an election because they said, this guy can't serve, it's not reasonable. The last hallmark of white minority rule is they're all white. Israel's Supreme Court has 15 members. The last time it had 15 members, long story, right now they're a little short. 10 of them were what I call WASPs, white Ashkenazi secular with pull. 2 more were white, but they wore yarmulkes. The remaining 3, 2 were Sephardic Jews, 1 was an Arab. There's no ultra-Orthodox Jew who has ever served on the Israeli Supreme Court in history. There've only been a handful of Sephardic Jews, a handful of Arabs. It's basically a club, an insular club of WASPs. This is how white minority rule works. And this is what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to dismantle, and they'll never forgive him for it.
Yeah, well, certainly the Israeli left, to some extent like the American left, thinks it ain't democratic unless they're in control. So they've redefined democracy in that way. And my last question, I want to know, are you optimistic about the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship under Trump? Or are there reasons to worry, both about this administration and sort of the little civil war going on about Iran, as well as the influence of some people on the right who are not friendly to Israel, and what the next Democratic Party president will do in the Middle East whenever that happens?
So I'm very optimistic. I'm always optimistic. This is a dream team from Israel's perspective. I really don't see Trump turning on Israel. He might have another idea about how to handle Iran. I frankly don't agree with it. I don't see how you're going to get to a diplomatic deal, especially after Biden attempted to do exactly that and failed. So I'm a little skeptical, but I have a lot of faith in President Trump when it comes to Israel. He's proven himself. Whatever one thinks about his other policies, he's certainly proven himself on Israel. I'm also very optimistic even for the Democrats, because this phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, it crisscrosses through many other issues. And eventually they're going to get tired of losing elections, and they're going to understand that discriminating against white people because they perceive them as a white group of privilege is just not a winning formula. And the American people are a very fair people at their core. But they're not going to tolerate it. And they really want to do the right thing. And they don't want to discriminate against minorities, but they don't want to discriminate against anybody, including white people. So this is just not going to go on. So ultimately, the fact of the matter is also, despite the verbal assault on Israel, I can say literally my entire life, in the New York Times, among academic elites, this is not a new thing. But yet, 80% of Americans are still describe themselves as supportive of Israel. In other words, people get it. The American people are really fair, and they're also really, really smart.
Yeah, I think it's an 80-20. I do agree. I think it is basically an 80-20 issue, but it is not an 80-20 issue right now in the Democratic Party. And, well, we'll see whether that changes. Ory, thanks so much for joining us today. Good luck with your new book. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, whether you're listening to us on one of the other various podcast platforms or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel. Please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week. And thanks again to our sponsors, the Jewish Future Promise. Sign the promise at jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise.